Hi guys, my name is Claudia, and we're gonna be talking about history, like how to reload history through video games. This is like a question that we have been asked ourselves during our past years in making games. And the question, even though it could sound silly, is what is history? Everybody in this room probably has its own or her own opinion about this. But more or less, can we all see the video? Yeah. More or less, it's something that, like, we can all agree that it's something that it's related to an account of events that happened to the past. So whatever arrives into a book can be considered somehow history. But more precisely, we'd like to quote this historian called Jacob Anderson, and I'm going to read this quote because I don't remember it by heart. He says, "History is a narration of events which have happened among mankind, including an account of the rise and fall of nations, as well as of other great changes which have affected the political and social condition of the human race." Okay. This is where things get complicated, because if history is a narration, who is the narrator? Which events are considered to be remarkable enough to enter official history? Which nations, which changes, which conditions, we could say also, are we taking into account? So that's why the definition of history that we prefer is the one that has been given by an historian called Carr. He said, history is it's a continuous process of interaction between the historians and his facts, an unending dialogue between the past and the present. And this is why we decided to open our talk with this video. This is a video loop. The video that you're seeing is actually a loop of an American visual artist called Michael Sommeroff. In his project, this is taken from his project that is called Absence of Subject. What he did, he took the pictures of a German photographer, a very important German photographer of the beginning of last century called August Sander. This German photographer decided that he wanted to take pictures of all the people of Germany among all different classes. So he's known because of his portraits. What Sommeroff did many years after, he decided to remove the subjects from his pictures. So he actually digitally removed all the actual elements inside the work of August Sanders. So those are the picture of five blind girls around 1930. So when it comes to history, you can definitely see what we mean. We mean this interaction between the past and the present. And the interactions, it's based on the fact that when you see an historical records, you start to ask questions about what is this record about. So are these girls still alive, for example? What happened to them during the Nazi regime? So those are questions that you start to ask yourself when you work with the historical elements. And this is what you do. You make, as the quote I read just 2 minutes before, you start to make an unending dialogue between the past and, of course, the present. But what is interesting when you start to deal with this dialogue is these are other images of Sommeroff and August Sanders. The one with the subject, of course, are the image of August Sanders, and the one without the subject are the one of Sommeroff. When you start to work digitally with the historical material, you can actually become to make some tricks. I place these images one after the other, but maybe the digital image could actually depict the moment before the girls actually enter into the garden, and not the moment after. So I show you a few other examples. of what we mean by an unending dialogue between past and present. So, who we are. We started making games, indie games, together as We Are Müesli, the most silly name you can pick because we didn't believe to make it, in 2013. After years of working in very different fields of communications, such as TV, graphic design, editorial, packaging, some journalism, and things like this, we decided at some point to actually combine our expertise in storytelling and make games, or whatever you could call them, because, you know, people say they might not be games, what we do, but anyway, we make narrative, whatever, about cultural, artistical, and historical topics. But of course, at the beginning, we didn't have a clear idea of what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do things. So we started in 2013 with a competition that doesn't necessarily mean winning a competition makes like a winning team last long. But anyway, our first game was this R5 visual novel called DEUS VIDET, which is Latin for, sorry, I'm looking at Matteo because it always says to me that I should stop making the translation of this Latin name of the game. But anyway, it was inspired by the work of a Dutch painter called Hieronymus Bosch. And as a game, it's about multiple interpretation of the painting of Hieronymus Bosch. We ended up obsessively researching into the work of Bosch, and we ended up really studying all the little meaningless details that the painter was placing into his canvas. But what may look like just another oddity in the painting, like the one that you're seeing right now, you're seeing like a man that is displaying his mutilated foot. So what could look just like another oddity is actually, it's a glimpse of a much bigger picture. It's a glimpse of a forgotten piece of European Middle Age history, which really is, it's called ergot poisoning, also known as St. Anthony fire. But as you can see, that detail, it's placed in a kind of in a place that it's, yes, you can see it, but that can be lost because there are so many other information inside the painting, and sometimes history is really like a full combination of a lot of information, and you have to decide as a narrator what kind of information you want to bring with you. As we said, we didn't have a clear idea about what game we were making, but we travel a lot. We've always been good travelers, and we wanted to exploit our attitude towards working and living as a form of a way of telling narratives. So in another narrative game that was released a couple of months ago, or more than a couple, I can't remember, that it's called the Great Palermo, we explored the folklore of the city of Palermo in Sicily. And even though it's mainly based on the theme of the street food, like a Fer Rouge, when making the Great Palermo, we discovered a lot of beautiful things about the Sicilian history, like this. This is an inside view of what I consider to be my Sistine Chapel experience. Everybody has one. This is an inside view of the Martorana Church. It's one of the masterpieces of the so-called Arab Norman period of Sicily around the 13th century. This is a Christian church, but let's have a look what it's inside this church. I think it's the only example in the world of a church that allows inscription from the Quran. We are talking about 800 years ago, and it's so contemporary somehow because there is people who want us to believe that the clash of civilization is something that happened just right now. But 800 years ago, this church was the living proof of globalization. We have a point. We're going to talk about games too, okay? Don't worry here. So we keep on stumbling upon history, even like making non-narrative games, but yeah, like this one that you're seeing here, that it's a casual game. It's multiplayer. It's called Sihei Yuan, which is the Chinese word to say courtyard. And we made this game for Beijing Design Week in 2015. And again, why are you laughing? Ah, okay. No, well, the Beijing Design Week, it's much better than this, but yeah, much worse actually. But so we made this game for the Beijing Design Week in China last year in October 2015, and we made it to explore this traditional and traditional way that Chinese people, this beautiful way that have Chinese people to occupy the streets and play games. So again, this project here that we made was another attempt to talk about somehow history. But what is history in game? So this is a Steam screenshot that we took a couple of months ago of games tagged as historical. These were the top 10 selling historical games. What do we have? Apparently, it seems like that history is synonymous with war, and above all, World War II in particular. Only thing is that in video games, war is not just a theme. It's a kind of dictate that it kind of dictates the genre of the games that chose it as a setting. So we use in video games, Second World War. It's a theme and also a genre. And most of the time, as a mechanic, it ends up being like either a first-person shooter, where you replay history from one perspective only, which mainly is the one of a soldier, or a strategy game. Like, for example, you replay history from the ruler's point of view. You're a kind of god, and this is how historical games depict history in the mainstream sector. Rulers and soldiers are the only possible narrators of history. Sounds like really a narrowing of game design potential, don't you think? Moreover, it also sounds like a narrowing of our idea of history, as this sarcastic definition of this American writer states. History, an account mostly false of events mostly unimportant which are brought about by rulers, mostly, I can't pronounce that word, if someone helps me, and soldier, knaves, and soldier, mostly fools. We think there is so much more to tell about war as a video game theme, not as a genre. And these are some of the games that we believe they give a very good contribution about this topic, about using history as a form of opportunity to bring people closer to historical facts. This is Unmanned by Molindustria and Jim Monroe, and it's a game about drones, and it's a very touching experience. Then we have things like Valiant Hearts, that it's another way of talking about history, above all talking about war and history. Obviously, everybody is familiar with this War of Mine. Or things like this game here, like this experimental indie game. It's again about drone, and it's again a very touching experience. But also, for example, things like this game, My Child Labour's Born, which really talks about some of those historical facts that don't make their entry into the history books. And it talks about some particular aspects of children who were born by Swedish women and German men. And these children, after the Second World War, were literally condemned of a very sad life. So just to talk about what we do with our experiments and with our game experiences, we want to talk about our game. And it's a war game. I'm going to put the trailer, and if the music is too loud, I'm going to ask my... Is it okay, the music? Okay, sorry. Is the music too loud? Is it okay? Okay. Okay, this is a game that was commissioned by the City Council of Sesto San Giovanni, and it's very strange in Italy that a City Council commission a game. It's called Venti Mesi, which is the Italian way. It means literally 20 months. 20 months where how much time Italian people had to resist against Nazi fascist regime. So we decided to give 20 different points of view about what it meant to live on a daily basis the war in Milan area. And those are some of the images we depict. Okay, when we started to make this game, we had few problems. Some of those problems were personal because we were personally engaged with the topic because of our connection, family connection with the topics of the Second World War. But when we started to make this game, the first thing that we did after we decided that the concept was making a game about 20 different points of view, 20 points of view of different people, was like making an index of, and make a distinction between what were the actual historical facts and what were fictional facts, so based upon research that could be like somehow rewritten in a way that could sound, that could fit into the historical facts. So this is the very simple structure of the game. You have a date, a precise collocation with the historical countdown. Then you have, as I said, where in Milan happened that thing, and how can we add fictional experiences inside that part, and then obviously the point of view of the character. So we ended up looking at a lot of historical records, but the one that really got our attention is this one. And we believe sincerely that images are not just objects that you can look at, are also objects that you can read. So we started to read this image. As you can see, there are two men. The first question you ask yourself is, who are those two men? What is, for example, their age? What does their body language reveal? So you can see there is a soldier checking the civilian paper, but the civilian is checking the soldier intensively. The soldier is standing comfortably straight, but leaning towards the civilian somehow. The civilian is making an open posture and wants to look a little bit casual, like the Italian casual way. But however, his shoulders are trying to look a way out. And look at like other details, like for example, the hands. The soldier is browsing the paper. His hands look busy, but somehow they don't look to me like threatening hands. Whereas the civilian is literally holding something, like he wants to keep something safe, like he wants to keep a secret, reinforcing his fake open posture, for example, with the elbow. And by the way, no wedding rings, so despite their manly attitude, I reckon that these two men are really young. The civilian has a torn shirt, which wears like with no care. Have a look at his hat. He's sitting on his head in a comical and caring way. The soldier's face is actually caged into the helmet, turning his chin into a gautier. And other little details, like yesterday we talked about non-narrative storytelling. The civilian is holding an umbrella, but does he really look like a person who cares about the weather? Maybe someone who really cares about him reminded him to take an umbrella when he was going towards his workplace. So this care can be also perceived on the civilian clothes, like it looks like a very, it looks a very precise person, but actually if you look closely, his vest looks upside down. The camouflage is actually in the inside and not on the outside. So is he really a tough guy? Or is he clumsy? Surely one of the things they share in common is this tension, this very intense moment. They're both very tight-lipped about the situation. So by reading this image, you start to make the narrative going, narrative flow. So we translated the images into this artwork. So really, the first reloading history hint that we want to give is that game design can be an interpretation of historical records. So use game design as an opportunity also to reload historical records. We did this throughout the whole game. We used a lot of other references. We didn't want to use the actual real picture because there is a real picture of this massacre that was done in Milan 50 years ago, but we translated this homicide of these partisan workers into this canvas here. Or like, for example, the Mussolini speech that he made again in Milan 2 or 3 months before he was hanged. We translated into this image. And because the game talks about dialogue, in this particular scene it's a personal dialogue between Mussolini and an old woman, we kind of played in this way.
Yeah, and sometimes history crosses path with our personal history. And for instance, this one here is a letter that my grandfather, who had been deported to a German prison camp as a prisoner of war, wrote home to his sister, and is writing, "Oh, dear sister, I'm fine, I'm okay, I hope you're okay too back home, and please send me something to eat, send some tobacco, and hugs and kisses, your brother Mario." And we decided to turn the text of this letter into one of the 20 stories of Venti Mesi. But take a look at the date the letter has over there. It's the 25th of December 43, and so it's Christmas, but there is no mention of Christmas at all in the letter. So basically in the game too, and that's the same process that my mother, for instance, has gone through while rereading this letter. She was asking to herself, just like this character in the game asks herself after having read this letter, why isn't he mentioning the fact that it's Christmas? Is the situation in a Nazi lager so horrible that you're actually writing 25th of December and you don't even realize that it's Christmas Day? So this is what we mean with an example of what we mean by saying that an opportunity that games dealing with historical topics have is this one here. So building a game structure that creates some space of playability between what is factual and what is counterfactual, or what is fictional, and there is space actually to also tell like personal stories framed within an historical setting and playing with different interpretations, and all the examples that Claudia already showed you about Venti Mesi. So moving back to Steam, this is another screenshot. When we took this screenshot, these were the 10 most recent games released on Steam tagged as historical. And we found out that it was kind of peculiar, the fact that there is so much focus on ancient times. There's so much like ancient Egypt and ancient Rome and feudal Japan. So very often when you think, at least like on Steam, most of the game tagged as historical are dealing with ancient, with ancient history, which we found, if you think about it, it's kind of strange that so many developers choose ancient times as their topic, because a lot of things that we know about ancient times can be assumptions, because so many years have passed that we might not know exactly how was life in ancient Greek, or we can miss so many references about what the reality actually, the actual reality of ancient Greek was. Like, for instance, according to some studies, the Greek white statues that we all think about when we think about ancient Greek were actually brightly colored like this. But in the real world, maybe it has to do with the fact that there's a generation of game makers and who was born like in the 70s and 80s, and maybe it's trying to, I don't know, that's my guess, to confront with the times they were born in. More games are being released recently that have a setting, a much more recent setting, like in the 70s, for example. Let's talk about the 70s. Tale of Tales, of course, set Sunset. It has this setting in the 70s and dealing with themes like dictatorship that were a precise and specific topic of death era, but again, history as a dialogue between the past and the present. Few more examples. The Vanishing of Ethan Carter's backstory has to do with the collapse of the mining industry in Wisconsin. That's just a backstory, but it has to do with that specific time the game is set on. Recently, 1979 Revolution Black Friday was released, and the topic of this game here again is the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And then, of course, there is this game by Santa Ragione, Wheels of Aurelia, which is set in 1978. The game is also on the showcase here, and there are quite a lot of girls and guys who worked on this game here. So, and we collaborated on Santa Ragione's game too by writing the story and the dialogues for the game. And Pietro's idea was actually to set the game in 1978, which was a crucial year for Italian history. One of the most most remembered fact of that year was the kidnapping of Aldo Moro, who was probably the most famous Italian politician back in the days. He was the president of the Christian Democracy, which was the most important Italian party back then. And so the game is set actually between the time of his kidnapping and between the time he was found dead, shot by the Red Brigades, which was a far-left terrorist organization. And so when Pietro and Santa Ragione proposed us to write the story, there were so many different topics that we could choose to deal with. And one of these was the Italian feminist movement, because Italy back in the days, maybe now too, was pretty conservatory country, and there was the divorce law had just been approved, and an abortion law was being discussed. So the idea was to choose, first of all, a young woman as a protagonist of the game. So a very interesting thing for us was, while writing the dialogues and the story of these characters, was to pick some cultural references from the time. These are two women of the time. To the right is Anna Oxa. Even Italian people may not recognize her. She was very young in 1978. She was 18. She had just participated to the Sanremo Music Festival, creating a big controversy about, oh, this young woman dressed as a man. What a provocation for Italian standards. Another to the right is Mariangela Melato, this beautiful Italian actress and model of a strong but at the same time very contradictory woman. So in the game, also the minor characters that we wrote story and dialogues for were, we could say, they were expressions of some specific issues or some specific topics that were discussed in that specific year. Like, for instance, the one to the right is Olga, this young woman. And by writing the character of Olga, we try to deal with the issue of abortion, which was a well discussed topic during that specific year. Again, this other character here is named Angelo. He's somehow honest man, let's say, but he's a former racing driver, but at the same time now he's turned into a bank robber. So he's living this contradiction of being a normal man, let's say, that is now dealing with issues of violence, and it's technically he's a criminal, and violence was another pretty heavy topic back in the 70s. And another minor character is this priest. Here, and why a priest in this game? Because again, 1978 was a year of great turmoil for the Catholic Church too. So aside from all the narrative structure of Wheels of Aurelia, in terms of of story and dialogues, the fact that we try to focus on was this idea here of trying to write some characters for the game that were contradictory expressions of the context. So all the way we wrote the characters for this game was all meant to express the contradictions of the context, thus creating space, again, a space of playability in the dialogues themselves. So to wrap up, I'm just skipping a few slides maybe. Just a couple of warnings. First of all, when making games that deal with historical topics. The first one is this here. This quote is maybe attributed to Abraham Lincoln, and it's about the research. There is so much research you have to do when writing or making a game about historical topics. Why? Because of this. Because of accuracy. Of course, as you say, this quote attributed to Abraham Lincoln says it all, that accuracy is an issue, and double-checking and triple-checking every cultural reference that you make in a game that has a very specific setting, of course, is something you have to be super careful about. So these are the final thoughts. The first one, this one here, history. As we saw, we considered it a sort of goldmine of potential game narrative and design in general. And sometimes when we make some courses on workshops, some students ask us, "Oh, where can I find inspiration for making a narrative game?" And what we used to suggest to them usually is try to look for inspiration to the very opposites of the spectrum. You can find inspiration in history, as we saw, but at the same time you can find inspiration in your own personal, even intimate experience. And these are three examples of free indie autobiographical game. Lieve Oma is in the showcase here too. Memoir and Code by Alex Camilleri is another brilliant example. But as we saw with the case of the letter of my grandfather, sometimes personal history and history cross path with themselves, and that was also the example of this game here, Cosmic Top Secret, which was the recipient of Most Amazing Game Award at the Maze Festival in Berlin, where the game director, Trine Leyer, she took this opportunity to turn this personal discovery of hers, of what her father's real job was. She found out that the father was a Danish intelligence service agent, and she turned it into this playable documentary, which is at the same time something very personal for her, but at the same time it is even though pretty fictional, it is anyway pretty accurate depiction of the Cold War paranoia. There is no better medium than games, we think, to make local history global. And this is maybe a silly example, but I guess it's pretty clear. This is a game that was made during Global Game Jam this year in Malta. And this guy, Jean-Luc Portelli, made this audio game that is based on the fact that there are no IKEAs on the island of Malta. So many Maltese people take a ship to Sicily, where there is actually one IKEA, and they buy all sorts of furniture for their friends and family, pack everything, and drive back to Malta. And so there is this moment when you receive this phone call from your friends and family, and you have to try to check if you actually bought everything according to the codes of the IKEA pieces of furniture. And it turned this hyper-local piece of Maltese contemporary history, I would say, into the concept for his very fun game. If history repeats itself, the emotions it evokes can be universal, and so history deals with universal concepts like freedom, justice, and power, and so playing with it can evoke these universal emotions, no matter where or when are in comparison of where and when the historical events take place. And we guess Papers, Please has been one of the most brilliant example of representation of the absurdity of power and bureaucracy, and all the tragedies also behind migration, which is a very contemporary issue, as we all know. Further thing, historical does not mean educational. We think it is very cool when games strengthen the knowledge, but we don't think that historical games should be strictly educational. It doesn't mean that we don't like or we're against educational game, and you can just think about all the influence that a game like Oregon Trail has had on the American collective, on so many generations of young Americans. But if you think about a game like 80 Days, is 80 Days educational? No, it's a game, and it's a beautiful game, but at the same time you learn so many things while playing this game. And history is controversial, actually. So why not to make games that are controversial indeed? There was this example, this kind of infamous example a few years ago about the JFK assassination. The game was called JFK Reloaded. It was back in 2004. And it was a short simulation of those seconds in Dealey Plaza in 1963. And sure, the fact that you were actually playing the role of the president's killer and you were technically shooting him dead was not something that can be taken with a light heart. But at the same time, somehow this game contributed or tried to give its contribution to the historical dialogue that is already going on about this fact. And the question was, given the ballistic information that we have, was it possible for Lee Harvey Oswald to technically shoot JFK just by himself? And you know, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about this. But in one of his jokes, proverbial jokes, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek radicalizes this concept of history as a dialogue between the past and the present with this quote here, which is a Hegelian student is asked by his history teacher, "Oh, is it true that Napoleon won the Battle of Austerlitz?" To which the student replies, "We will see." And so history is a game itself. It's a land of narrative opportunities, a field of possibilities, and the way we see it, there is no better medium than video games to explore such field and to, as we said, reload and replay history and to interrogate it about how we got to be where and who we are. So be it modern history, like here, or contemporary history, like here, or also some other pieces of history that are mostly forgotten. Just think about all the history of the decolonization movement in Africa. There are so many topics that we can deal with our games. So be it modern, contemporary, or very contemporary, we think that as game designers, that is a beautiful responsibility we can all choose to take for ourselves. Thank you.